The ivory envelope on the mahogany table seemed to weigh a ton. Blake Remington fixed his gaze on the words, "Petition for Divorce," printed in elegant letters, feeling as if each letter was a dagger piercing his chest. The office on the 47th floor of Remington Tower, overlooking the Manhattan skyline, had always been his refuge, his territory of conquest. Now it seemed to suffocate him. "Mr. Remington, the board meeting starts in 5 minutes." His assistant's voice sounded over the intercom, snapping him out of his dark thoughts. "Cancel." His voice came out hoarse. "Cancel everything for today." For the first time in his 35 years of life, Blake Remington, CEO of Remington Industries, an empire valued at billions of dollars, felt completely defeated. The irony was not lost on him. The man who built his reputation on never losing a trade was about to lose the one thing he discovered truly mattered. 3 years ago, when he proposed a marriage of convenience to Harper Collins, heiress of Collins Industries in Boston, everything seemed perfectly calculated. Merging the companies would be beneficial to both of them. It would save her company from bankruptcy and expand his empire into the lucrative pharmaceutical sector. The contract was simple: a 3-year marriage, appearances kept in public, freedom behind the scenes. What Blake didn't plan on was falling in love. Harper revolutionized her orderly life with her vibrant presence and fierce determination. She brought color to her monochromatic world of spreadsheets and contracts. But he, in his characteristic arrogance, continued to treat the marriage as just another business transaction. Spinning in his chair, Blake surveyed the city that spread out below. New York had always been his playground, the perfect setting for his business achievements. Now, every skyscraper seemed to mock his current powerlessness. His cell phone vibrated. A text from Harper. "Please, just sign the papers. Don't make this any harder than it needs to be." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Blake stood up abruptly, grabbing his coat. I needed to see her, talk to her in person. Harper had been staying at the Peninsula, one of Manhattan's most exclusive hotels, since moving out of their Upper East Side mansion 2 weeks ago. The car ride seemed endless, even as your driver deftly navigated the city's traffic. Blake mentally replayed every moment of the last few months: the canceled dinners, the missed calls, the broken promises. How did you not realize you were losing her? In the hotel lobby, his imposing presence caused the usual buzz. Blake Remington was a well-known figure in New York high society, his face often gracing the business pages and society columns. Harper. He found her in the hotel restaurant, sitting alone with an untouched cup of tea in front of her. She looked up, and Blake felt his heart sink. Harper looked stunning as always, her golden brown hair framing a face that could have been sculpted by Renaissance artists. But there was a sadness in her green eyes that he had never seen before. "What are you doing here, Blake?" "I can't sign." "Can't or don't want to?" She sighed, tired. "Our agreement is over. You got what you wanted. The expansion of Remington Industries was a smashing success. Now let me move on. What if I say I want more than a deal?" Harper laughed humorlessly. "Now? After 3 years of treating me like a successful corporate acquisition?" "I made mistakes." Blake leaned forward, his voice low and intense. "Many mistakes. But you're not an acquisition, Harper. You're—" He hesitated, the words choking in his throat. "What am I, Blake? Another asset in your portfolio?" "You're everything," he finally admitted, the words coming out like a painful confession. "And I was an idiot for not realizing that sooner." The silence that followed was deafening. Harper studied him for long moments, her eyes searching his face for anything that might indicate whether this was another of his negotiating tactics. "You're right," she finally said, standing up. "You were an idiot, and now it's too late." Blake watched helplessly as she walked away, her soft scent remaining as a painful memory. But as he watched her leave, a fierce determination grew in his chest. He built an empire from scratch, won impossible corporate battles, turned bankrupt companies into success stories. Winning Harper's heart back would be his greatest challenge, and he had no intention of failing. That night, alone in his penthouse office at Remington Tower, Blake began to plan. Not as the calculating CEO he always was, but as a man who finally understood that there are things that all the money in the world can't buy, and some battles are worth more than any corporate merger. The sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Somewhere in that huge city, Harper was planning a life without him. Blake looked at the divorce papers still untouched on his desk and made a silent promise. This time he would fight not for a contract, but for love. The announcement of the Remington Foundation's annual benefit gala flashed insistently on Harper's laptop screen. In other times, she would be busy choosing the perfect dress and coordinating the last details of the event. Now, sitting in her suite at the Peninsula, the invitation seemed more like a twist of fate. "You don't have to go," said Rachel, her best friend since their Stanford days, adjusting her gold-rimmed glasses as she settled in on the couch. "No one would expect that from you, considering the circumstances." Harper ran his fingers through his hair, a nervous habit he'd developed over the last few years. "Blake knows the Collins Foundation still depends on donations from this gala. He's forcing me to show up." "That manipulator," Rachel muttered, but Harper interrupted her. "No, this time it's not his fault. My family foundation really needs these funds. I can't abandon the legacy my parents built just because my marriage failed." Across town, in Remington Tower, Blake was having his own internal battle. Stephen Patterson, his lawyer and longtime friend, watched him with concern as he paced the office. "You realize you're playing a dangerous game, don't you?" Stephen questioned, adjusting his navy blue tie. "Harper might claim harassment if you keep pushing." Blake stopped abruptly. "I'm not pushing. I'm fighting for my marriage." "A marriage that started as a business contract," Stephen reminded him gently. "And it became so much more than that," Blake replied, his voice thick with restrained emotion. "You don't understand, Steve. I spent 3 years living next to the only person who saw me beyond the Remington Empire, and I was too stupid to realize what I was missing." The silence that followed was interrupted by Blake's cell phone ringing. It was a message from her sister, Madison. "Harper has confirmed attendance at the gala. I thought you should know." A discreet smile appeared at the corner of Blake's lips. It was the opening he needed. On the night of the gala, the Plaza Hotel was transformed into a modern fairy tale setting. Crystals sparkled from the ceiling, elaborate arrangements of white orchids decorated each table, and the cream of New York society circulated over glasses of champagne and whispered conversations about the Remingtons' impending divorce. Harper arrived at 8 p.m. sharp, wearing a midnight blue dress that hugged her curves elegantly. She kept her head high as she navigated the room, greeting acquaintances and potential donors with her practiced hostess smile. "You look stunning," Blake's familiar voice sounded from behind her, making her heart skip a beat. Turning slowly, Harper found her husband still impeccable in his tuxedo, his blue-gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach turn. "Blake," she managed, keeping her voice steady, "I hope we can keep up appearances tonight for the sake of the foundation." "Appearances?" He stepped forward, invading her personal space. "When did we start pretending, Harper? Because I remember clearly the moment I stopped acting." The orchestra began to play a gentle waltz, and before Harper could protest, Blake led her onto the dance floor. Their bodies moved in perfect synchronization, the result of 3 years of social events and galas like this one. "What are you doing?" she whispered, trying to ignore the familiar warmth of his hand on her waist. "Dancing with my wife," he replied simply, but his eyes conveyed much more. "Ex-wife soon," Harper corrected, though the words sent a sharp pain through his chest. Blake gently spun her around, pulling her even closer as he brought her back. "You know what I recently discovered? That all those contracts, mergers, and acquisitions that built my empire mean absolutely nothing when compared to the contract that really matters, our wedding vows." "Vows that were written by lawyers," Harper countered, but his voice shook. "Then let me rewrite them," Blake declared, stopping dancing in the middle of the room. Here and now, in front of everyone. Harper's heart raced as he held her hands in his. The other couples stopped dancing, and a circle formed around them. "Blake, don't do this," she begged in a whisper. But he had already started. "Harper Collins Remington," his voice boomed through the now silent room. "You are not a contract to me. You are not a merger or an acquisition. You are the dawn after an endless night, the answer to questions I didn't even know I had." Tears began to form in Harper's eyes, and she could feel the eyes of hundreds of people on them. "You're mine," he continued, his voice cracking with rarely shown emotion. "Not because a legal document says so, but because every beat of my heart recognizes this truth, and I will be yours, if you give me a second chance to prove it." The silence that followed was deafening. Harper felt as if the world had stopped, frozen in that moment of public vulnerability from one of the most powerful men in New York. "How can I trust?" she finally managed to say, her voice just a whisper. "I don't ask you to trust now," Blake replied, his thumb gently stroking her hand. "I'm just asking for the chance to rebuild that trust, day by day." Before Harper could respond, Madison appeared at her side, breaking the tension of the moment. "Sorry to interrupt, but donors are waiting for the opening speech." Harper took the opportunity to walk away, her heart pounding as she took the stage to give her usual speech. But as she talked about hope and second chances for the families benefiting from the foundation, her eyes kept finding Blake's in the crowd, and she wondered if maybe, just maybe, a few second chances were worth the risk. The morning after the gala, Harper woke up to a flood of notifications on her phone. Blake's public statement had become the hottest topic in Manhattan social circles, with photos and videos of the moment circulating on social media and gossip sites. "Remington Empire tycoon makes passionate declaration to wife amid divorce rumors," Harper read the New York Post headline with a weary sigh. His phone rang, displaying his mother's name on the screen. "Harper, honey, I just saw the video," Diana Collins spoke bluntly. "Blake has always had a natural talent for the show." "Mom, please." "I'm not defending him," Diana interrupted. "I'm just saying that, unlike your father, at least Blake is fighting for his marriage." The mention of her father made Harper shudder. Gregory Collins had abandoned his mother after 25 years of marriage, fleeing to the Bahamas with his assistant of 22 years, leaving the family business on the brink of bankruptcy. "That's different," Harper protested, but her voice wavered. "And even?" Diana questioned softly. "Are you sure you're not letting the fear of the past dictate your future?" Before Harper could respond, a knock on her suite door interrupted the conversation. When she opened it, she found a breakfast cart complete with her Jean-Georges favorites, including almond croissants and eggs Benedict with smoked salmon. The attached card simply said, "I remember every detail about you. B." Across town, Blake was having an unusual meeting in his office. Sitting across from him was Dr. Michael Pearson, one of New York's most respected therapists. "So, Mr. Remington, what brings you here?" Blake adjusted his tie, visibly uncomfortable. "I need to understand where I went wrong. With Harper, with my marriage, with myself. And this search for understanding has nothing to do with divorce papers." "It has everything to do with it," Blake admitted. "But not in the way you think. I'm not just here to stop the divorce. I'm here because even if Harper signs those papers, I need to understand why I turned something precious into yet another business transaction." Dr. Pearson took some notes. "Tell me about your childhood." "Classic," Blake laughed humorlessly. "Are you going to tell me that all my problems started because my father was away?" "You're the one who mentioned your father," the therapist observed calmly. The silence that followed was heavy. Blake stood up, walking to the window. "My father built Remington Industries from the ground up. Every time he closed a big deal, he promised he would spend more time at home. He never did. When he died in a helicopter crash, I was 19 years old and made a promise to myself to never be like him. And yet, And yet I became just like him, Blake added, painful realization in his voice. Meanwhile, Harper was having lunch with Rachel at Le Bernardin, trying to ignore the curious looks of the other customers. "So what's his next move?" Rachel asked, tasting her wine. "Besides the 5-star breakfast?" "I have no idea," Harper replied, playing with her food. "But I know Blake. He always has a plan." As if to confirm his words, the sommelier approached with a bottle of Chateau Margaux 1982. "Courtesy of Mr. Remington. He mentioned it was the wine from your first date." Harper felt her heart skip a beat. It hadn't been a real date. It was a business meeting at Le Cirque to discuss the terms of the marriage contract. But she remembered clearly how carefully Blake had chosen the wine, commenting on the red fruit notes and the long, elegant finish. It was the first time she saw a glimpse of the man behind the businessman. "He's playing dirty," Rachel commented as the sommelier walked away. "No," Harper replied softly. "He's finally playing fair." That night, while working in her suite, Harper received an email that made her heart stop. It was from Remington Industries, with the subject line, "Changes in the Executive Board." With trembling fingers, she opened the document. Blake was temporarily stepping aside as CEO to resolve personal issues, delegating day-to-day responsibilities to the company's COO. His phone rang almost immediately. It was Madison Remington. He really did it. Madison's voice was thick with amazement. "Harper, in 20 years, I've never seen my brother take a day off voluntarily, let alone an indefinite leave of absence." Harper sat heavily in her chair, the implications of that decision weighing on her. Blake was effectively choosing her over the company, something she had begged for countless times during their marriage. "Why now?" she whispered, more to herself than to Madison. "Because now he finally understands what he has to lose," Madison replied softly. "The question is, are you still willing to give him the chance to prove it?" Harper looked out the window of her suite, watching the lights of Manhattan twinkle against the night sky. Somewhere in that city, the man she loved was finally fighting for them, not with grand, empty gestures or commercial promises, but with real change and genuine vulnerability. The question was no longer whether she still loved him. That was never the issue. The question was whether she had the courage to risk her heart again, betting that this time it would be different. That this time love would be enough. Dr. Pearson's therapy office became an unexpected refuge for Blake in the weeks that followed. The sessions, initially uncomfortable, began to reveal layers of complexity that he had never allowed himself to explore. "You mentioned that Harper brought color to your world," Dr. Pearson commented during a particularly intense session. "Can you elaborate on that?" Blake adjusted himself in the leather chair, his fingers drumming restlessly on the arm of the chair. Before her, everything was about numbers and graphs and projections. Harper, she saw beauty in things I considered irrelevant. She once canceled an important meeting because she saw a dog abandoned on the street. "And how did you react?" "I was furious," Blake admitted, the memory still vivid. "I told her she was being irresponsible, but she just looked at me with those determined green eyes and said, 'Some things are more important than quarterly profits, Blake.'" Across town, Harper faced his own demons. Sitting in the office of Dr. Catherine Chen, her therapist for years, she tried to process the recent changes in her life. "How do you feel about Blake leaving the company?" Dr. Chen asked, closely observing her patient. "Confused," Harper answered honestly. "For 3 years I begged for moments of attention. Now he's willing to abandon everything, and that terrifies me." "Why are you terrified?" "Because—" Harper hesitated, tears threatening to fall. "What if it's not enough? What if after a few weeks he realizes he prefers the corporate life? I can't go through that loneliness again." Her mother's words about not letting the past dictate her future echoed in her mind. It was hard not to see parallels between her situation and her parents' failed marriage, even though the circumstances were completely different. Meanwhile, Madison Remington watched the changes in her brother with a mixture of admiration and concern. During lunch at the trendy new restaurant in Tribeca, she couldn't help but notice how Blake seemed simultaneously more vulnerable and stronger. "Are you really going to therapy twice a week?" she asked, still in disbelief. "3, actually," Blake corrected, finishing his coffee. Dr. Pearson suggested extra sessions to work on specific issues about behavior patterns. Madison almost choked on her smoothie. "Who are you, and what did you do to my workaholic brother?" "It's still me, Maddie," he smiled lightly. "I'm just trying to be a better version of myself. Not for Harper, but because I realized I need that." Blake's transformation process did not go unnoticed by the media. The New York Times published an article speculating about the real reasons behind his temporary departure, while gossip blogs placed bets on how long his Zen phase would last. Harper tried to ignore the media coverage, but it was difficult when their every move was scrutinized. One afternoon, while walking through Central Park trying to clear her mind, she literally ran into Blake. "I'm sorry, The words died in her throat when she recognized him, dressed casually in jeans and a t-shirt, something she had rarely seen during her marriage. "Harper?" He looked equally surprised, but there was something different in his eyes, a calm she didn't recognize. "What are you doing here?" she asked, noticing that he was alone, without his usual entourage of assistants and security guards. "Walking," he replied simply. Dr. Pearson suggested that exercise in the outdoors may help with anxiety. The vulnerability in his admission caught her off guard. The Blake she knew would never admit to having anxiety, let alone seek help to deal with it. "That's good," she managed, feeling her heart speed up at his proximity. "Do you want to walk with me?" he asked, and there was something almost shy in his tone, a quality she would never associate with the powerful Blake Remington. Harper hesitated. Part of her wanted to keep her distance, to protect her already hurting heart. But another part, a part that refused to be silenced, yearned to understand this new Blake who was emerging. "Okay," she agreed softly, "but only one lap." They walked in silence at first, the autumn New York air creating an almost magical atmosphere around them. It was Harper who finally broke the silence. "Why now, Blake? Why not when I begged for change before?" He stopped walking, turning to face her. "Because before I was too arrogant to admit that I needed to change. I thought I could fix any problem by throwing money at it, like I did my whole life. Losing you..." He paused, swallowing hard. "Losing you showed me that some things are irreparable with money or power." The raw honesty in his words hit her hard. This wasn't the Blake who made grand public gestures or manipulated situations to his advantage. This was a man admitting his faults, showing his scars. "I still don't completely trust you," she admitted, her own honesty echoing his. "I know," he replied softly. "I'm not asking for immediate trust. I'm asking for a chance to earn it back, day by day, small step by small step." Harper looked at the man in front of him, still Blake Remington, still carrying the weight of an empire on his shoulders, but now also carrying something new, the courage to be vulnerable, to admit his faults, to work on himself. "Baby steps," she agreed finally, and the smile that lit up his face was genuine, reaching his eyes in a way she had rarely seen during their marriage. As they continued their walk, Harper realized that maybe, just maybe, the biggest changes started with the smallest steps, and perhaps the love they shared deserved a second chance to blossom, this time on more fertile ground of mutual understanding and personal growth. The dream of the perfect dinner began to crumble when Blake found the kitchen of his penthouse in complete chaos. Burning pans, smoke everywhere, and the unmistakable aroma of culinary failure hung in the air. After 3 weeks of intensive therapy and personal changes, he decided to take a bold step, inviting Harper to a homemade dinner prepared by his own hands. "Mr. Remington, can I call Chef Maurice?" His housekeeper, Mrs. Peterson, offered hesitantly. "No," Blake replied, determined. "Harper always said I was too dependent on others. I need to do this on my own. As he cleaned up the mess and started again, Blake reflected on his last session with Dr. Pearson. Vulnerability is not weakness, the therapist had said. It's courage to show who we really are, imperfections and all. Across town, Harper was having his own existential crisis. Sitting in her temporary office at the Collins Foundation, she stared at an old photograph, her parents on their 20th wedding anniversary, smiling as if nothing could destroy that happiness. 5 years later, his father would leave, leaving only debts and broken hearts. "You're not your mother, and Blake isn't your father," Rachel commented, entering the room with 2 coffees. "And before you say you weren't thinking about that, I know that look." Harper accepted the coffee, allowing the comforting aroma to calm her. "Blake invited me to dinner, on the rooftop. Just the 2 of us." "Oh," Rachel raised an eyebrow. "At the scene of the crime, so to speak?" "Rachel." "Sorry, too sensitive?" Rachel sat down. "But seriously, how do you feel going back there?" Harper hesitated. The Park Avenue penthouse had been his home for 3 years, the place where she shared silent breakfasts with Blake, where she waited countless nights for him to return from work, where her dreams of a royal wedding slowly withered. "Scared," she admitted. "Not for the reasons you think. I'm afraid I'll go back there and realize it still feels like home." At 7 p.m., Harper found himself in the private elevator going up to the penthouse. His hands shook slightly as the doors opened, revealing the apartment he knew so well. The smell of something burnt mixed with floral perfume greeted her. "Blake?" she called, walking down the hall. "In the kitchen." His voice sounded strangely nervous. Harper stopped abruptly at the kitchen entrance. Blake Remington, the man who ran a billion-dollar empire, was covered in flour with a sauce stain on his shirt that probably cost more than a lot of cars. "Are you cooking?" she asked, incredulity in her voice. "Trying," he admitted, running a hand through his hair and spreading more flour. "I wanted to make that homemade pasta you love, but apparently years of MBAs didn't prepare me for it." Harper felt something melt inside her. This wasn't the Blake she'd known, the perfectionist who never admitted fault, who outsourced any task he hadn't completely mastered. "Can I help?" she offered softly. Blake hesitated, clearly torn between his pride and the desire to not completely ruin dinner. "You weren't supposed to be helping. It was supposed to be a surprise." "Consider me surprised," she smiled, removing her coat. "Now, where's the recipe?" Together they navigated the chaos of the kitchen. Harper taught Blake the secrets of homemade pasta, something he had learned from his grandmother. Between measuring flour and turning the dough, the carefully constructed barriers began to fall. "Remember the first time I tried to cook for you?" Harper asked, as Blake cut cherry tomatoes, horribly unevenly. "How could I forget?" he laughed. "The fire alarm went off and 3 fire trucks showed up. And you were furious because you had to cancel a video conference with Tokyo." Blake's smile disappeared. "I was an idiot." "It was," she agreed, but her voice was gentle. "But he's trying to change that now." While the dough rested, they opened a bottle of wine and moved out onto the porch. The city glowed below them, a sight that used to be their daily backdrop. "Why here?" Harper finally asked. "Why bring me back to this place?" Blake swirled the wine in his glass thoughtfully. "Because this is where I made my biggest mistakes. I thought maybe if we could make new memories here, honest memories." "We can't erase the past, Blake." "I don't want to erase it," he interrupted, turning to face her. "I want to learn from him. I want to prove that I can be better, not just with big gestures or public statements, but in the little moments, like ruining a kitchen trying to make homemade pasta." Harper felt tears forming in her eyes. "You're really in therapy." 3 times a week, he confirmed. "And for the first time in my life, I'm actually listening, not just pretending to listen while I plan the next acquisition." The kitchen timer sounded, calling them back to reality. As they finished dinner together, Harper realized that something fundamental had changed. Not just Blake, but her as well. The fear was still there. The The scars from the past still hurt, but there was something new growing between the cracks. Hope. Dinner wasn't perfect. The pasta was a little thick in some parts. The sauce was slightly salty. But as they shared the imperfect meal at the kitchen table instead of the formal dining room, Harper felt like maybe, just maybe, the imperfections were exactly what they needed. After the rooftop dinner, something subtle but significant changed in the dynamic between Blake and Harper. Like pieces of a puzzle finally starting to fall into place, they discovered a new rhythm in their interaction. No longer the perfect social couple, no longer distant strangers, but two people relearning how to know each other. A week later, Harper found herself in Boston, overseeing the reopening of a pediatric ward at Collins Children's Hospital, a project her mother had started decades ago. As she walked through the newly renovated hallways, her phone buzzed with a message from Blake. "How's Boston? I heard it's going to rain. Don't forget your umbrella. I know you always do." The message, so simple and homely, made his heart sink. It was the kind of everyday worry she had always wanted during her marriage. Now it felt almost surreal to receive it. "Dr. Remington?" a nurse called her, and Harper noticed how she still responded automatically to her last name. Representatives from Phillips Medical have arrived for the meeting. The meeting was about new equipment for the pediatric ward, a substantial donation that the Collins Foundation had secured. Harper conducted the presentation with professionalism, but his mind occasionally wandered to Blake and his recent changes. Across the country in San Francisco, Blake was attending a medical technology conference. It was his first business trip since starting therapy, and he found that his perspective on work had changed drastically. "Mr. Remington," an executive approached him during the coffee break, "could we discuss the proposed merger over dinner?" In other times, Blake would have canceled any personal commitments to close a deal. Now he checked his watch. It was 5 p.m. in San Francisco, 8 p.m. in Boston. "Unfortunately, I have an unpostponable appointment at 6 p.m., he replied, surprising himself and the executive. "Can we reschedule for tomorrow during lunch?" At 6 p.m. sharp, Blake was in his hotel room, laptop open for an online therapy session with Dr. Pearson. There was no business important enough to make him skip a session. "How are you dealing with the distance from Harper?" Dr. Pearson asked after they discussed the week's progress. "It's different," Blake admitted, adjusting his posture in the chair. "Before, I barely noticed it when I was on business trips. Now I feel it every mile away." "And how do you express that to her?" Blake hesitated. "I try to be more present, even from a distance. Messages, calls. But sometimes I wonder if I'm suffocating her." "Why do you think that?" "Because..." Blake ran a hand over his face tiredly. "What if every message I send reminds you of all the times I didn't care enough to send one?" In Boston, Harper faced her own demons during her session with Dr. Chen, who had agreed to remote consultations during her stay. "How do you feel about Blake's attempts to reconnect?" Harper watched the rain begin to fall through his hotel room window. Scared, hopeful, confused. It's as if his every gesture now illuminates all the absences of the past. "And is that necessarily bad?" "I don't know," Harper sighed. "Part of me wants to believe he's really changed. Another part is waiting for the moment when everything goes back to normal. Him immersed in work, me waiting for crumbs of attention." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Upon opening it, Harper found a delivery man with a package. Inside was an emerald green umbrella, his favorite color, and a card, "For when you inevitably forget yours. B." That night, as rain fell over Boston, Harper picked up her phone and did something she hadn't done in a long time. She called Blake just to talk. "Harper?" His voice sounded surprised and sleepy. It was 11 p.m. in San Francisco. "Sorry, did I wake you up?" No. I was just reviewing some contracts," he replied, and Harper felt her heart sink. Some things never changed. But then Blake continued. "Actually, that can wait until tomorrow. How was your day?" The ease with which he put his work aside to talk to her almost brought tears to her eyes. They talked for almost an hour about the hospital, about the conference, about the rain in Boston and the sun in San Francisco. It was the kind of casual conversation that normal couples have every day, but to them it always seemed like an unattainable luxury. "Harper," Blake said as comfortable silence settled between them. "I know I'm trying to make up for 3 years of mistakes, and that sometimes I can seem too intense. If you need space, just tell me." The vulnerability in his voice made something awaken inside her. "It's not space I ever wanted, Blake. It was presence, and not just physical. It was knowing you were really there, with me, not just thinking about the next deal or the next meeting." "I know," he replied softly, "and I regret every moment I wasted not understanding that." When they hung up, Harper realized he was smiling, a genuine smile, not the polite smile he'd perfected for social events. In San Francisco, Blake put away the contracts he was reviewing, realizing that for the first time in his adult life, work wasn't his first priority when he woke up. Bridges of trust were being rebuilt, slowly, brick by brick. Not with grand gestures or dramatic statements, but with small moments of truth and presence. And maybe, just maybe, these new foundations would be stronger than the old ones. An unexpected invitation from Remington Industries took Harper to New Orleans, where the company maintained an important pharmaceutical research facility. The official message mentioned an awards ceremony for scientists in the Division of Pediatric Oncology, but it was Blake's handwritten postscript that made her heart skip a beat. "There are places here that mean more than you know." New Orleans had been the setting for their honeymoon. 3 hurried days of business meetings and conference calls. At the time, Harper tried to romanticize the trip, even as Blake spent most of the time on the phone closing an acquisition on the West Coast. "You don't have to go," Rachel had said when Harper mentioned the invitation during their weekly lunch in New York. "You can send a representative from the Collins Foundation." "It's not that simple," Harper replied, rummaging through his coffee. "Oncology research is crucial to the hospital in Boston. Plus," she hesitated. "Besides, you want to see if Blake has really changed when it comes to work," Rachel added, knowing her friend all too well. The Ritz-Carlton in New Orleans was just as Harper remembered. Elegant, with that unique blend of Southern charm and modern sophistication. As she checked in, a familiar voice surprised her. "I thought I'd find you here." Harper turned to find Madison Remington, looking flawless in a white blazer, her Louboutin heels echoing on the marble floor. "Maddie, I didn't know you were coming." "Blake asked me to meet you," Madison explained, linking her arm with Harper's as they walked toward the elevators. "He's stuck in an emergency meeting in Chicago, but he'll be arriving tonight." The familiar tightness of disappointment began to form in Harper's chest. But Madison continued, "Before you think the worst, he canceled 3 important meetings to be here as quickly as possible. Old Blake would have just rescheduled the entire event." In the bedroom, Harper found a bouquet of pink peonies, her favorite, with a card. "Forgive me for being late. Some changes take time, but I'm trying. Dinner at 8? B." The afternoon was filled with visits to the research facility, where Harper was genuinely impressed by advances in pediatric treatments. But it was during a quiet moment, watching the scientists work, that Madison made a revelation that caught her off guard. "Do you know why Blake chose New Orleans for this research center?" Harper shook his head, assuming it had been a purely business decision. "Our mother died of cancer when Blake was 16, Madison said softly. "The last place we visited as a family was New Orleans. She loved jazz and beignets from Café du Monde." Harper felt her heart sink. In 3 years of marriage, Blake had never spoken about his mother. Why didn't he ever tell me? Blake buried a lot of things when he took over the company at 21, Madison explained. I think therapy is helping him unearth some of them. At 8 p.m., Harper met Blake in the hotel lobby. He looked tired, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. "Sorry I'm late," he said immediately. "The private jet had mechanical problems in Chicago, and I almost chartered a commercial, but—" "You're here now," Harper interrupted him softly, noticing how genuinely sorry he looked. Blake took her not to one of the fine restaurants in the French Quarter, but to a small jazz club on Frenchman Street. The place was full, live music filling the atmosphere with melodic saxophone notes. "The first time I came here was with my mom," Blake said as they settled into a table in the back. "She said music was the language of the soul." Harper watched the man in front of her, not the ruthless CEO or estranged husband she had known, but someone more vulnerable, more human. "Madison told me about her," Harper admitted. "Why didn't you ever talk about this before?" Blake was silent for a moment, her fingers playing with her napkin. "Because talking about her meant admitting that I missed her, and feeling was never my strong suit. And now? Now I understand that burying feelings doesn't make them disappear." He met her eyes. "It just makes them more toxic. Dr. Pearson helped me see that." Conversation flowed naturally during dinner, punctuated by soft music and the intimate atmosphere of the place. Blake talked about his mother, about how she took him to listen to jazz even when his father disapproved of such distractions. Harper shared stories from her own childhood, including difficult times following her father's departure. "You know what scares me the most?" Harper asked when dessert arrived, still warm beignets from Café du Monde. "Seeing you changing makes me realize that maybe I need to change too. Like this? Maybe I let the fear of abandonment, because of my father, stop me from truly trusting. Even before you became a workaholic, I expected to be disappointed." Blake reached across the table, intertwining his fingers with hers. "Then maybe we can learn together. Me to be more present, you to trust more." After dinner, they walked the historic streets of New Orleans, the humid air carrying the distant sounds of music and laughter. Stopping in a small square, Blake turned to Harper. 3 years ago, when we came here on our honeymoon, I was on the phone closing the acquisition of Pacific Tech," he said. "I barely noticed how your eyes sparkled in the city lights, or how you smiled every time you heard music on the street." Blake. "No, let me finish." He stepped forward. "Now I realize how much I've lost by always chasing the next deal. But if you give me a chance, I'd like to create new memories here. Memories where you're the only thing that matters." Harper felt tears form in her eyes, but this time they were tears of hope. The changes in Blake were real, not just in grand gestures, but in the small moments of vulnerability and honesty he shared now. As jazz music floated through the New Orleans night, Harper realized that maybe love wasn't just about finding the right person, but about two people choosing to grow together, day after day, note after note, in a single imperfect melody. After returning from New Orleans, Blake and Harper developed a new routine, not as structured as their old marriage, but also not completely separate as in the early days after filing for divorce. It was a delicate balance between closeness and independence, built on the foundations of their growing mutual honesty. One particularly busy morning at the Collins Foundation, Harper received an unexpected call from Stephen Patterson, Blake's lawyer. "The divorce papers are still pending," Stephen began bluntly. "I need to know how to proceed." Harper felt her stomach drop. With all the recent changes, I had almost forgotten about the legal document that started this entire transformation. "I need more time," she replied, surprising herself with the hesitation in her voice. Across town, Blake faced his own challenges. The board of Remington Industries was uneasy about his partial removal, and an emergency meeting was called. "We cannot continue in this administrative limbo," declared Richard Maxwell, the board's longest-serving member. "The company needs full-time leadership." Blake adjusted his tie, a nervous habit that therapy helped him identify. "I agree. That's why I propose a permanent restructuring. I want to establish a new management model that allows me to balance my personal and professional life." A murmur went through the meeting room. Blake Remington, the notorious workaholic, talking about balance. It was as if a leopard announced that it was changing its spots. That afternoon, Harper met Madison for lunch at the new bistro in Greenwich Village. The venue, with its exposed brick walls and hanging plants, offered a welcoming setting for intimate conversations. Blake proposed a complete restructuring of the company, Madison revealed, stirring her jasmine tea. He wants to create a system that allows the company to function without him having to be there 24/7. Harper almost choked on her risotto. Is Blake voluntarily lessening his control over the company? Apparently some priorities have changed. Madison smiled meaningfully. The conversation was interrupted by a text from Blake. Dinner today? I have news to share. Harper responded in the affirmative, but an old anxiety began to surface. What if the news were a setback? What if all this progress was temporary? Dinner was arranged at Harper's apartment at the peninsula, neutral territory, as they began to call it. Blake arrived promptly at 7 p.m., carrying a bottle of wine and a folder of documents that made Harper's heart skip a beat. It's not the divorce papers, he assured her quickly, noticing her expression. These are the Remington Industries restructuring documents. As they poured wine, Blake explained his plan. The company would be reorganized with a more distributed leadership structure, allowing him to maintain the strategic vision without having to micromanage every decision. It's a significant change, Harper commented, studying his face. Are you sure you're ready for this? No, Blake admitted with an honesty that would have been unthinkable months ago. But I'm ready to try. Dr. Pearson helped me understand that excessive control is a form of fear. Afraid of what? Of failing, of not being enough, of... He paused, taking a sip of wine. Losing people I love, like I lost my mother. Harper felt her eyes water. This vulnerability, this willingness on Blake's part to expose his deepest wounds, was more powerful than any grand gesture he had ever made. Do you know what else I learned in therapy? He continued, moving to sit next to her on the couch. That sometimes trying to control everything is the surest way to lose what really matters. Like us, Harper added softly. Like us, he agreed, his fingers finding hers. But I don't want to be that person anymore, Harper. I don't want to be the man who chooses spreadsheets over real moments, who confuses professional success with personal fulfillment. And who do you want to be? Someone worthy of your love, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. Someone who understands that true strength is not in control, but in the ability to be vulnerable, to admit mistakes, to grow. Harper felt her heart speed up. His therapist's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is giving a second chance, not just to others, but to ourselves. We still have a lot of work to do, she said finally. I know, Blake replied, gently squeezing his hand. But for the first time in my life, I'm more interested in the process than the end result. The rest of the night was spent in honest conversations about fears, hopes, and dreams, not just for their relationship, but for their individual lives. Harper talked about her plans to expand the work of the Collins Foundation, and Blake really listened, offering ideas and support without trying to control. When Blake departed hours later, he left behind not only the restructuring documents, but also a sense of possibility that Harper hadn't felt in a long time. In her apartment, she took out the divorce papers she still had in her drawer. The pages, once so definitive, now seemed to belong to a different reality, a reality where second chances were impossible, and people couldn't change. Maybe, she thought, putting the documents back in the drawer, some stories need to be rewritten to find their true ending. The autumn sun filtered through the windows of Dr. Chen's office as Harper settled into the familiar leather armchair. 3 months had passed since the divorce papers arrived at Blake's office, and life had taken unexpected turns for both of them. How do you feel about Blake's progress? Dr. Chen asked, her discerning gaze studying the subtle changes in her patient's posture. It's weird, Harper admitted, playing with the edge of her blouse. Part of me still hopes I'll wake up and discover that this was all temporary, that the old Blake will return with all his obsession with work and control. What about the other party? The other part is scared because they are starting to believe in this change. Harper paused, collecting his thoughts. Yesterday, for example, Blake canceled an important meeting because I promised to show him the Collins Foundation's new project for art therapy in children's hospitals. At Remington Tower, Blake faced his own moment of reflection during his session with Dr. Pearson. The panoramic view of Manhattan, which previously made him think about acquisitions and mergers, now served as a backdrop for deeper conversations. "How are you dealing with the company's restructuring?" Dr. Pearson questioned, noticing the tension in Blake's shoulders. "It's challenging," Blake admitted. "Yesterday I delegated an important decision to the new COO. My first instinct was to step in, to take control. But then I remembered what it means to truly trust a team." "How did Harper trust you to change?" Blake smiled slightly. "Exactly. And speaking of Harper," he paused, adjusting his tie, "I'm thinking about doing something that might seem crazy." That afternoon, Harper received a cryptic message from Madison. "I need your help with something special. Meet me at the High Line at 3 p.m. The elevated park was particularly beautiful at this time of year, with the leaves changing color and the autumn sun casting long shadows across the ancient trails. Madison waited near one of the hanging gardens, a mysterious smile on her face. "What's going on, Maddie?" "Blake is selling the penthouse," Madison bluntly revealed. Harper felt her heart skip a beat. "What? But that apartment is old Blake's symbol? The workaholic CEO's trophy?" Madison added. "That's exactly why he wants to get rid of it." As they walked through the elevated park, Madison explained that Blake was looking for a new place, not a sterile, impersonal penthouse apartment, but a real home. "He wants you to help him choose," Madison finished. "If you want, of course." Harper felt a wave of conflicting emotions. The penthouse had been the setting for so many moments, some painful, others precious. It was where she had waited countless nights for Blake, where her dreams of a royal wedding had slowly crumbled, but also where, recently, they had begun to rebuild something truer. "Why didn't he ask me directly?" "Because he doesn't want to push," Madison explained softly. "Blake is learning to respect boundaries, remember?" That night, during an impromptu dinner at the small Italian restaurant they discovered together in Greenwich Village, Harper brought up the subject. "Madison told me about the penthouse," she said, watching Blake's reaction. He paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. "I was going to tell you, I was just looking for the right moment." "And when would that be?" "When I was sure it wouldn't feel like manipulation or pressure," he admitted, setting the cutlery aside. "Harper, that penthouse represents everything I was. Cold, calculating, control and status obsessed. It's not who I want to be anymore." Harper studied the man in front of him. The Blake he'd met 3 years ago would never admit vulnerabilities so openly. "And what kind of place are you looking for now?" "A place that reflects who I'm becoming," he replied, his eyes meeting hers. "Maybe a brownstone in the West Village, with a little garden in the back. A place where we can—" He hesitated. "Where I can create new memories, whether alone or, if you want, together." The "if you want" hovered between them, loaded with possibilities and unspoken hopes. It was further proof of Blake's change. He wasn't assuming or demanding, he was offering a choice. "Can I think about it?" Harper asked softly. "Of course," Blake smiled, and it was a genuine smile, not the rehearsed smile he usually wore in business meetings. "There's no rush. I'm learning that some things are worth the wait." As they enjoyed the tiramisu they shared for dessert, Harper realized that perhaps they were creating something entirely new. Not a reconciliation based on old patterns, but a relationship built on stronger foundations of honesty, mutual respect, and personal growth. Autumn in New York continued its dance of transformation, leaves changing color just as people could change their deepest natures. And in the midst of this urban metamorphosis, two hearts began to believe that maybe, just maybe, love could be even more beautiful the second time it blooms. The first sign of winter arrived in New York with an unexpected snowfall, transforming the city into a postcard setting. Harper watched the snowflakes outside her office window at the Collins Foundation, reflecting on how her life had changed in the last few months. The sound of her cell phone brought her out of her reverie. It was a text from Blake with a photo of the brownstone he was considering buying in the West Village. What do you think of the bay windows? Perfect for a small library, the message said. Harper smiled, remembering how he had once casually mentioned his dream of having a reading nook overlooking the street. The fact that Blake kept this seemingly insignificant detail warmed his heart. The windows are beautiful, she replied, hesitating before adding, "Can I see it in person after work?" The response was almost immediate. "Of course. I'll meet you at 5 p.m.? While organizing her appointments for the afternoon, Harper received a surprise visit from Rachel, who walked in carrying 2 Starbucks cups and a worried expression. "So, I heard you're helping Blake pick out a house," Rachel began, handing over one of the coffees. "Are you sure this is wise?" Harper sighed, spinning in her chair. "Honestly, I don't know. But I also don't know if it's wise to continue keeping my distance when he's clearly trying hard to change. People don't change overnight, Harper." "No, they don't," Harper agreed, picking up her coffee. "But it's been 3 months, Rach. 3 months of consistent therapy, of real changes in the company, of small gestures that show he's really paying attention." Rachel studied her friend for a moment. "You still love him, don't you?" "I don't think I ever stopped," Harper admitted softly. "But now it's different. It's no longer that desperate love that accepts crumbs of attention. It's something more mature." Across town, Blake was in his own therapy session, discussing his anxiety about the new home search. "You seem particularly agitated today," Dr. Pearson observed. "Harper agreed to see the house with me today," Blake explained, adjusting his tie, a nervous habit he was learning to recognize. "It's the first time she's shown interest in something that could be our future. And that scares you?" "It terrifies me," Blake admitted, with an honesty that would have been unthinkable months ago. "What if I screw up again? What if the old habits return? How would you handle it if it happened?" Blake reflected for a moment. "Different from the past. Now I have tools. I have you, I have my therapy, I have a new structure in the company that doesn't depend exclusively on me. But mainly," he paused, organizing his thoughts, "mostly I now understand that professional success means nothing if you're failing at the things that really matter." At 5 p.m. sharp, Harper met Blake in front of the brownstone in the West Village. The snow continued to fall gently, creating an almost magical scene on the tree-lined street. Blake was already there, talking to the realtor, but her eyes immediately met Harper's as she approached. "You look beautiful," he said softly, and there was a sincerity in his voice that made Harper blush. The house was exactly how Harper would imagine a real house, welcoming, with character, completely different from the sterile penthouse Blake called home. As the realtor showed the rooms, Harper noticed little details that revealed how much Blake had thought of her when choosing the place. The spacious kitchen she always wanted to cook in on the weekends, the office with enough room for 2, the back garden where they could have coffee on spring mornings. "What do you think?" Blake asked when they were alone in the living room, the realtor discreetly stepping aside to give them privacy. Harper touched the bay window frame, imagining pillows and a small bookcase. "It's perfect," she admitted. "But Blake, are you sure? It's so different from your style." "My style is changing," he replied, moving closer. "Or rather, I'm rediscovering who I really am without all those layers of control and status obsession." Harper felt her heart race at his proximity. "And who are you?" "Someone who finally understands that a home isn't made of Italian marble and state-of-the-art security systems." He smiled softly. "It's made of shared moments, of laughter over breakfast, of discussions about what color to paint the walls." "Are you really talking about painting walls?" Harper teased, trying to ease the intensity of the moment. "I'm talking about building a real life," Blake replied seriously. "With imperfections, with compromises, with joint growth. If you want." The "if you want" hovered between them, loaded with possibilities. Harper studied the man in front of him, still Blake Remington, still carrying the weight of an empire on his shoulders, but now also carrying something new, the ability to be vulnerable, to admit mistakes, to prioritize what really matters. Let's go slow, she finally said. One step at a time. Blake's smile lit up his face. I can work with that. After all, I've learned that some things are worth the wait. As the snow continued to fall outside, Harper realized that perhaps they were writing a new chapter. Not a simple reconciliation, but a mutual rediscovery, built on stronger foundations of understanding and personal growth. Blake's decision to buy the West Village brownstone triggered a series of changes that no one could have predicted. One particularly busy morning, Harper found an old box in her office at the Collins Foundation. Memorabilia from the beginning of their marriage that Madison had discovered while cleaning Blake's penthouse. I thought you might like to see this, Madison said, leaning against the office door as Harper opened the box with hesitant hands. Inside were photographs, cards, and little keepsakes that told the story of their marriage, not the public, polished, perfect version they presented to society, but genuine moments that had been forgotten along the way. Look at this, Harper whispered, picking up a crumpled photo. It was from their first official dinner as a couple, even before the wedding. In the image, Blake smiled in a way she'd rarely seen since, carefree, almost boyish. He changed so much after he fully took over the company, Madison commented, sitting next to Harper. It was as if I had put on armor and never taken it off. Until now, Harper added softly. Across town, Blake was having a difficult conversation with the board of Remington Industries. The restructuring was meeting resistance from some more conservative members. We can't risk the stability of the company because of your personal situation, Richard Maxwell argued, his voice thick with disapproval. Blake adjusted his posture in the chair, maintaining the calmness he had learned from months of therapy. My personal situation made me realize that a truly strong company should not depend on a single person. We are creating a more resilient system, not a weaker one. What if it goes wrong? Asked another counselor. Then we will learn from our mistakes and adjust course, Blake replied with a serenity that surprised even himself, as I have been learning to do in my personal life. In the afternoon, during his session with Dr. Pearson, Blake reflected on how his new approach was affecting different aspects of his life. You seem more centered today, the therapist observed. It's weird, Blake admitted, looking out the office window. Before, I measured success by the number of deals closed or the value of shares. Now, I find satisfaction in things I used to consider insignificant. Like what? Like picking paint colors with Harper for the brownstone, he smiled. I never thought that spending 2 hours discussing shades of blue could be more rewarding than closing a multi-million-dollar merger. Meanwhile, Harper shared her own findings with Dr. Chen. I found our old photographs today, she said, playing with the edge of her blouse. It was like seeing two different people, who we were at the beginning and who we became. And how do you feel about these two versions? The truth? Harper paused, collecting his thoughts. I think we needed to lose ourselves in each other to truly find ourselves. In the evening, Blake and Harper met for dinner at the little Italian restaurant that had become their special place. The establishment, with its checkered tablecloths and candles and antique wine bottles, offered an intimacy that the elegant restaurants they used to frequent never managed to provide. I found some old stuff today, Harper mentioned as they shared a burrata. Madison told me about the box, Blake replied, his eyes meeting hers. You know what scares me most? How I changed after those first photos. How I turned into someone I never wanted to be. Why do you think this happened? Blake considered the question for a moment. Dr. Pearson helped me understand that it was fear. Fear of not being good enough, of not honoring my father's legacy, of showing any vulnerability. And now, I now understand that true strength lies not in never showing weakness, but in having the courage to be authentic. He paused, taking a sip of wine. Even if it means admitting that sometimes I don't have all the answers. Harper reached across the table, her fingers finding his. It was a simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. a silent recognition of the path they were both traveling. "The colors we chose for the brownstone," she began, changing the subject to something lighter. "I think teal would look perfect in the office." "Our office," Blake corrected softly, and the possessive pronoun hung between them like a promise. "Are we really doing this?" Harper asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Building something new?" "One brick at a time," Blake replied, lightly squeezing his hand. "No rush, no pressure, just building." The rest of the dinner was filled with conversations about details of the house, plans for the future, and memories of the past. No longer with regret, but with a new understanding of how each moment brought them here. As they said goodbye on the snow-covered sidewalk, there was a new quality to their embrace. No longer the mechanical gesture of a couple fulfilling social obligations, nor the hesitant farewell of ex-spouses trying to keep their distance. It was the embrace of two people who finally understood that true love is not about perfection, but about growing together through imperfections. The invitation arrived in an elegant gold envelope. Remington Industries' annual gala dinner was scheduled for next week. Harper looked at the card in her hands, remembering the last gala where Blake had made his public statement. It seemed like it happened in another lifetime. "You are going?" Rachel asked, watching her friend across the table at their weekly lunch at Le Bernardin. "It's different now," Harper replied, tucking the invitation into her bag. "It's no longer about keeping up appearances or fulfilling social obligations. It's about choosing to be there," Rachel added, understanding. Across town, Blake faced his own dilemmas during his session with Dr. Pearson. The approach of the gala brought old insecurities to the surface. "How do you feel about sharing this public space with Harper again?" the therapist questioned. "Nervous," Blake admitted, abandoning his usual controlled stance. "Last time, I made that grandiose statement without thinking about the consequences, without respecting her space. Now I want to do it differently." "And what would different be like?" "Honest, vulnerable, real," Blake replied, the words coming out with a sincerity that still surprised him. "Not the perfect CEO or the remorseful husband making grand gestures, just me." The week leading up to the gala brought significant changes to the brownstone. Harper had begun helping with the decorating, spending hours discussing paint tones and furniture arrangements with Blake. It was a therapeutic process for both of them, creating something new together without the pressures and expectations of the past. "I found this in the boxes in the penthouse," Blake said one afternoon as they organized the future office. It was a framed photo of them on Martha's Vineyard, taken during a rare weekend off in their first year of marriage. Harper took the photo, remembering that moment. "It was the only weekend you didn't bring in work." "And it was perfect," Blake added softly. "But I was so focused on proving myself through work that I forgot what it was like to actually live." The day of the gala arrived with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. The Plaza Hotel was magnificently decorated, as always, but there was something different in the air. Maybe it was the way Blake had reorganized the event, making it less about pageantry and more about the charitable causes they supported. Harper arrived wearing an emerald green dress that made her eyes sparkle. When Blake saw her, his heart stopped for a moment, not just because of her physical beauty, but because of what she represented, a second chance that he was determined not to waste. "You look stunning," he said as he approached, but his words carried an honesty that went beyond superficial praise. "You don't look too bad either," she smiled, adjusting the lapel of his tuxedo. It was an intimate, natural gesture that made them both realize how much progress they had made. During dinner, sitting at the main table, Blake surprised everyone by giving a speech that was very different from what was expected. "For years I measured success through numbers on spreadsheets and stock market shares," he began, his voice firm but vulnerable. "I built an empire, but I almost lost my humanity in the process. Today, thanks to some very special people in my life, I've learned that true wealth isn't in bank accounts." His eyes met Harper's as he continued. "It's in the moments we share, the second chances we give each other, the courage to admit our mistakes, and the strength to change. This foundation is no longer about showing power or influence. It's about making a real difference in people's lives. Harper felt tears forming in her eyes, not from the grandeur of the words but from the raw sincerity behind them. This wasn't Blake making statements calculated to impress. This was a man exposing his true heart. Later, as they danced to a slow song, Harper realized how everything had changed. Blake's touch was no longer possessive or controlling, but gentle and respectful. His eyes weren't roaming the room looking for important business contacts. They were fixed on her, present in the moment. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "On how we got here," she replied. "How sometimes we need to completely lose ourselves to truly find ourselves." Blake nodded, understanding. "Do you know what Dr. Pearson told me recently? That sometimes the universe breaks us down to rebuild us stronger, truer. Your therapist says something similar," he continued after a pause. "That real transformation doesn't happen in big moments, but in small daily choices. How to choose to paint a wall together instead of delegating it to a team of decorators," Harper teased lightly. "Exactly," Blake smiled, gently spinning her around on the dance floor. "Or how to choose to be here today, not out of obligation, but out of your own free will." The night progressed with a different quality than previous galas. It was no longer about keeping up appearances or impressing society. It was about two people rediscovering each other, building something new on the foundations of what they had learned. When the gala ended, Blake and Harper walked through Central Park together, the city glowing around them. There was no rush. There were no expectations, just two hearts beating in a rhythm that finally felt synchronized. "The brownstone will be ready next week," Blake mentioned casually. "I know," Harper replied, her hand finding his naturally. They didn't need to say anything more. Some truths are best expressed in the silence shared between two people who have finally found their way back to each other, not through grand gestures or lofty promises, but through the simple honesty of hearts that have chosen to grow together. The smell of fresh paint and new wood filled the air of the West Village brownstone when Harper arrived that Saturday morning. The New York winter was beginning to show its first signs of retreat, with timid rays of sunlight penetrating through the bay windows that had enchanted her so much from the first moment. "Second floor," Blake's voice echoed as she entered, followed by the sound of footsteps descending the wooden stairs. He appeared wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt, teal paint stains on his arms, a sight that still surprised her, even after weeks of makeover. "Are you really painting alone?" Harper asked, setting her bag on a nearby bench. "Dr. Pearson said manual activities can be therapeutic," Blake replied with a smile. "Plus, I've found that there's something incredibly satisfying about seeing the results of your own work." As they walked up the stairs together, Harper noticed how the house was already starting to take on character. It was no longer just an empty structure, but a space that reflected the transformation of both, the walls in soft tones chosen during long discussions, the preserved details of the original architecture, the subtle modifications that made the place unique. "The office is almost ready," Blake commented, opening the door to the room. The teal they had chosen covered 3 walls, while the fourth, where the library would be located, remained blank. "I thought you might like to paint this part with me." The offer was more than an invitation to paint a wall. It was a symbol of partnership, of joint construction. Harper felt his heart accelerate as he realized the depth of the gesture. "First," she said, turning to face him, "I need to show you something." Reaching into her purse, Harper pulled out a familiar envelope, the divorce papers that had been weighing down her drawer for months. Blake froze, her face momentarily losing color. "Harper." "No," she interrupted him softly. "Watch." With deliberate movements, Harper tore the documents into pieces, letting them fall like confetti onto the newly installed floor. The silence that followed was filled with the weight of thousands of unspoken words. Blake took a step towards him, his eyes shining with suppressed emotion. "He is sure." "I've never been so sure," Harper replied, his voice steady. "I'm not saying it will be easy, or that all the problems will magically disappear. But I want to build something new with you, not just this house, but a life together. Blake touched her face with gentle, ink-stained hands. I promise this time will be different. Not because I'm a different man, but because I finally understand that real change is a daily choice. And I promise to trust this change, Harper added, not blindly, but with eyes wide open to who we are now. They spent the rest of the morning painting the library wall together, in between talking about future plans and reflecting on the past. Blake talked about his last session with Dr. Pearson, where they discussed the difference between control and care. It made me realize that I spent so much time trying to control everything around me that I forgot how to simply care for the people I love, Blake admitted, carefully rolling the paint roller near the window frame. Harper smiled, remembering her own session with Dr. Chen. My therapist said something similar about trust, that it's not about being absolutely sure, but about choosing to believe even though you know the risks. During lunch, sitting on the living room floor with Thai food from Harper's favorite restaurant, they were surprised by a visit from Madison. "So it's true," she exclaimed when she saw the torn pieces of divorce papers still scattered around the office. "Rachel called me and said you were planning something big today, but I didn't realize." As always, news travels fast in Manhattan, Harper laughed, offering her spring rolls to her sister-in-law. "But this time," Blake added, "it's not about appearances or social expectations. It's about real, honest choices." Madison watched her brother with teary eyes. "You know, for the first time since Mom died, I see you truly happy." The afternoon brought Rachel, who arrived carrying a bottle of champagne and an expression that was somewhere between worried and hopeful. "I came to see if this is really what you want," she told Harper in a private moment in the kitchen. "Yeah," Harper replied simply. "Not because I have forgotten the past, but because I choose to believe in the future we are building." As the sun began to set, casting golden shadows across the bay windows, Blake and Harper found themselves alone again in the freshly painted office. The scent of fresh paint mixed with the smell of approaching spring, creating an atmosphere of renewal. "Do you know what I like most about this house?" Blake asked, hugging Harper from behind as they watched the street through the window. "What?" "That every detail has a story of ours. It's not just a place we bought ready-made. It's something we're building together, imperfections and all." Harper turned in his arms, studying the face of the man she had learned to love twice, first in his controlled and distant version, now in his truer and more vulnerable version. "Like us," she said softly. "Like us," he agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss that carried the flavor of second chances and new beginnings. The torn divorce papers still decorated the office floor as a physical reminder of Harper's decision when Blake woke up the next morning. He watched them for a moment, each piece representing a part of the past they were leaving behind, not to forget, but to build upon it something stronger. "We should frame some of these pieces," Harper suggested, entering the office with 2 cups of coffee. It was Sunday, and for the first time in years, Blake had no meetings or conference calls scheduled. "As a reminder?" he asked, accepting the cup she offered. "Like a transformation story," she corrected, sitting down next to him on the floor. "Each torn piece represents something that needed to be undone so we could rebuild." Dr. Pearson had talked about symbolic moments during his last session, actions that marked significant changes in our lives. Harper's act of tearing up the divorce papers wasn't just about saving a marriage. It was about consciously choosing a new path. "I have something for you," Blake said, standing up and walking over to his briefcase. He returned with an envelope similar to the one Harper had torn open, but this one contained different documents. "What is that?" "Remington Industries' new organizational structure," he explained, sitting down again. "Complete, permanent, and irrevocable. I am no longer the CEO who has to micromanage every decision. I am the chairman of the board, with a competent team managing the daily operations." Harper took the documents, her eyes scanning the pages carefully. "That's significant. As you said yesterday, it's not about forgetting who we were, but about consciously choosing who we want to be, Blake replied, his voice carrying a quiet certainty that was new to him. And I choose to be someone who prioritizes what really matters. Harper's phone vibrated. A message from Rachel asking if she was okay, if she wasn't rushing into things. Harper smiled, appreciating her friend's concern, but knowing in her heart that this decision wasn't hasty. It was the result of months of growth, therapy, and conscious choices. Madison is hosting dinner tonight, Blake mentioned, watching as Harper responded to the message. To celebrate our reconciliation? Fresh start? I'm not sure what to call it. How about simply our story? Harper suggested, putting away her phone. No labels or expectations. The rest of the morning was spent organizing the office, now no longer a renovation project, but a tangible symbol of their new life together. The shelves began to be filled with books by both of them, creating a library that reflected their combined personalities. I found this in the penthouse boxes, Blake said, holding up a small leather notebook. These are your notes from the first year of marriage. Harper picked up the notebook, remembering the times when he wrote down his thoughts and hopes. It was my makeshift diary. I stopped writing when things started to change. Read something to me? Blake asked softly. Harper hesitated before opening the notebook to a random page. Today, Blake smiled at breakfast. Not the professional smile he uses in meetings, but something real, almost vulnerable. Sometimes I see glimpses of the man behind the CEO, and I wonder if one day he will allow that man to appear more often. Blake was silent for a moment, absorbing the words. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand. It's not about regretting the past, Harper replied, closing the notebook. It's about appreciating the present and building the future. In the evening, dinner at Madison's house brought together her small inner circle. Rachel was there, still slightly skeptical but visibly touched by the change in Blake. Stephen Patterson, the lawyer who had prepared both the marriage contract and the divorce papers, raised a toast to the evolution of love. You know, Madison commented as they served dessert, Mom always said true love isn't found, it's made. Like a house, Blake added, his fingers intertwined with Harper's under the table. Brick by brick, choice by choice. Later, walking back to the brownstone under the starry Manhattan sky, Harper and Blake stopped at the small park where they had had so many difficult conversations over the past few months. It's not always going to be easy, Harper said, turning to face him. There will be days when old habits try to creep back in, when fear tries to creep in. And on those days, Blake replied, we will have our therapy, our friends, and most importantly, we will have each other, not as a contractual obligation, but as a conscious choice. The brownstone welcomed them with its new, welcoming familiarity. The freshly painted walls, the still-covered furniture, the half-unpacked boxes. It was all a testament to the work in progress that was their relationship. Do you know what I like most about this house? Harper asked, stopping at the entrance to the office where everything had changed the day before. What? That it allows us to start from scratch, but carrying all the lessons we've learned, she replied. Like us, new but wiser. Blake pulled her close, their embrace carrying the promise of all the tomorrows they would choose to build together. It was not the end of one story, but the beginning of another, one written not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with small moments of truth, vulnerability, and conscious love.